All right. Layer's law number 3 relates to quotations, and a particular issue I see quite commonly in student papers. And Layer's law number 3 refers to how you should hug your quotes. And what I mean by hugging your quotes is that you want to wrap them in context so the reader can appreciate what you're saying with that quotation, what you're going to be saying, why they should care, what's its significance. So first you're going to do this by setting up your quotation. You're leading the reader into it, so you're kind of anticipating what they're going to see in that quotation. And then afterwards, you're going to explain to the reader what they just saw. So you're going to lead them into it, you'll give them the quotation, and then you'll explain it to them after the fact. Often, students will just throw a quote into a paper. There's no context whatsoever. And so they're at least implicitly assuming that these quotes are self-evident, that the reader is going to automatically appreciate how and why it's there. But these quotations are not self-evident. You, as the author, needs to show the reader and give the reader appreciation for how and why this quote is significant. So here's an example of an unhugged quote, one that's not contextualized. If you want to run with the hugging metaphor, this is also one that's unloved. It's also sad and lonely because it hasn't been hugged. It's not wrapped in context. And this is a quotation from the Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, but it's talking about the issue of the iron cage in a little bit different terms than we're talking about it in this class. But nevertheless, this unhugged quote would take the form of, Weber argues capitalism is becoming like an iron cage, then automatically jumps into this quotation where the iron cage is mentioned. In Baxter's view, the care of external goods should only lie on the shoulders of a saint like a light cloak, which can be thrown aside at any moment. But fate decreed that this cloak should become an iron cage. And then immediately here the paper goes on to say, Weber also argues, so just going from there. This quotation is just thrown in there. There's no setup. Afterwards, there's no explanation of what this quote means or why it's significant. And if you just throw a quotation like this into a paper, unless this person is an expert on Weber, they're not going to understand what you're trying to say and what the significance of this quote is. So you, as author, as a writer, need to provide that quotation so the reader knows how to understand and appreciate it. Here is a way to convey the same point and the same quotation, but with the proper amount of hugging or contextualizing you would need to do in order for the reader to really appreciate what you're saying. So it'd be something like, Weber was concerned with rationality and thought the world was increasingly rationalized, with the result that the magical and mystical elements of life were being stripped away. For Weber, one major force driving this trend was capitalism and the rational orientation it forced people to make. Weber talked about this in terms of the iron cage of rationality. All of this is setting up the quotation, right? Weber is concerned about rationality. Capitalism forces people to think in a rational way, and the result is that these mystical and magical elements are being eliminated, and you're anticipating Weber's central metaphor for this process, which is the iron cage. Then you would use the same quote I used before in Baxter's view, the light cloak, but fate decreed it should be an iron cage. So I've set up the quote, I've given the quote. Now I say, for Weber, the spread of capitalism trapped us into thinking into very rationalistic terms. As such, it played a crucial role in the disenchantment of everyday life. I'm kind of restating the context, right? That capitalism has forced us to live in this iron cage of rationality. This is consequential because it disenchants everyday life. And so, in this quotation, I've set up the quote. I've given the reader information for how and why they should understand it. I give him or her the actual quote, and then I explain what they've just seen. You're going to be tempted just to throw quotes in there. What you need to do is you need to contextualize them. You need to make sure your quotes are hugged. If they're not hugged, they're not powerful. To have your quotes be effective and have them be an aid to your paper, you need to hug them. You need to contextualize them. You need to walk the reader through how and why they should appreciate them in the way that you think that they should. All right, there's law number 4. You need to explain to the reader what's going on in your paper. You just don't want to make statements or treat the statements that you're making in your paper as being self-evident. I see this issue crop up a lot, and in cases where people don't do well on paper, more often than not, it's because they're just stating their points. They're not explaining them. But the bulk of your points comes from the strength of your explanation, not statements. So explaining is really important. So explanation is more than a statement. Here's an example of a statement. X is illustrative of A. Y is the consequence of B. These are statements. These are assertions. X is A, Y is the consequence of B. An explanation takes the form of X is illustrative of A because, and everything that comes after because is your explanation. And this is where the bulk of your points will come from. This is what I'm looking for to see how you can explain the statements that you're making. So X is illustrative of A because, go from there. This means that, and you're explaining more. You're giving a more depth explanation. That's what I'm looking for. Similarly, Y is the consequence of B because, and then everything after the because is your explanation, and that's what I want to see. So, as a general rule, to test whether you're making just statements or whether you're explaining your points, look for because. If you're saying this is something because, then everything after because, that's your explanation. That means you've moved into the realm of explaining your points, not just stating them or asserting them. Make sure in your paper you're making an argument anchored in explanation, not just statements. And like I said, the bulk of your points comes from the strengths of explanation. My favorite question to write on papers or comments, one of them is why, or how and why, or sometimes I use the abbreviation EM, which is explain more. It means you need to go more in depth. I want to see that you really have an in-depth understanding of these things, and that all rests on your strength of explanation. So look for because, so know you're explaining, and then make sure you're really walking through a detailed explanation of the points you're trying to make. All right, there's law number 5. Don't use contractions, and the smiley face there should probably be the winky emoji. Don't is a contraction. In your papers, you can't use contractions. Don't, shouldn't, didn't, etc. Instead, you want to write it out. Did not, would not, could not. The one exception are direct quotations. If you're taking a direct quotation and someone uses a contraction, then yes, include the contraction. But in terms of the words that you're writing, make sure that you're not using contractions. Did not, would not, should not, should become, would not, did not, should not, as opposed to don't, wouldn't, shouldn't. Part of our charge at Gettysburg College is to teach you the communication conventions of our discipline. This is a big part of how sociology communicates. Most journals will not accept papers if you use contractions. Therefore, when it comes to our papers in class, we're supposed to mirror those communication conventions. Thus, you can't use contractions in these kinds of papers. On your reading notes, emails, completely fine, but not in formal academic papers in sociology. All right, there's law number 6. You want to make sure you support your argument with quotations. And you're doing this for 2 reasons. One is it helps demonstrate to the reader you're providing accurate representation of the material you're covering. You're showing that Weber thinks a particular thing, not that you think a particular thing. By saying Weber thinks X, and then having a quotation, properly hugged, that shows that takes the burden of proof off of you, right? In the sense that you're not making this claim. You're showing that Weber is making this particular claim. And it also helps strengthen your argument. It provides evidence that you know what you're talking about and that you are providing this accurate representation of a particular theorist's argument or case. As a general rule, you want 2 to 3 quotations per body paragraph. And if you're going to err on anything, err on the side of more. Now, I will put a caveat here. You want to use quotations strategically. And so not all quotations should come in equal length. And you don't just want to have like each body paragraph being 2 or 3 enormous block quotations. That's not good. That's overkill. Part of coming up with good quotations is that you as the writer are looking through this material to figure out what is the best quotation I can use in the sense that I'm going to provide what's relevant information for the reader, but so that the reader doesn't have to go back and read the entire book that I'm talking about or article that I'm talking about. So you want to be judicious in the length of the quotations that you're using. So sometimes part of your quote could be maybe half a sentence. If you set up a point and then you can show that the person agrees with it. Sometimes you need a quotation that's 2 or 3 or 4 sentences long. That's fine. But you want to demonstrate that you're familiar with the readings and that you are using a quotation that's appropriate to the topic that you're covering. And if you just start throwing huge block quotations in there, the signal that it will send to the reader is that you don't really know this argument well, so you're kind of throwing the kitchen sink at the reader in terms of the argument, as opposed to going through and figuring out what's the best quotation I can use in this section. So yes, anchor your arguments in the readings, use the readings to support the arguments you're making, but make sure that you're also demonstrating that you have a good understanding of this material and you are using good quotations to illustrate the point that you're trying to make. All right, there's law number 7, is you need to follow the ASA citation format. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because you have examples of what ASA formatting looks like. At this point in your career, this should be something that you've covered in other classes. If there's any questions about this, definitely let me know. But the expectation is that you will follow this format of citation format. Just really quickly, in-text citations and ASA have 3 parts, or generally 3 parts. The author's last name, or if you're using multiple authors, their last names. The year the work was published, and these 2 always need to be there. You always need a last name, and you always need a date of publication. And then if you're using a quotation or referencing specific information from a text, then you also need a page number. And so an ASA citation will generally take the form of Laird 2019 if it's like a general point, or Laird 2019 if I'm doing a quotation, and then 45, the page number where you could find that quotation. So, and the format generally goes, start off with the citation, author's last name, space but no comma, year of publication, colon, page number. That's the general format, and usually within parentheses. Citations generally go at the end of the sentence. So self-fulfilling prophecy is defined as this, and then this is a citation for Merton, 1948, colon, page 195. Others identify the color line as being the defining feature of the 20th century. Du Bois, 2015, colon, page 167. In terms of efficiency, if you are referencing an author's name in the same sentence where you're going to be using a quotation, then the year and page number can be moved to after you bring up the author's name in the context of the sentence. So if you say, person X argues this, and then give the quotation, you can say person X, parentheses, year of publication, colon, space, page number of the quotation, talks about this then, and then actually give the quotation, as opposed to saying person X argues this, quotation, then full citation. So an example would be Goffman, 1956, page 477, defines deference as, and then goes from there. If you're referencing a work in general and you're bringing up the author's name, then you would do the same thing, but you could leave off the page number. So Butler's 1990 General Troubles invites us to rethink traditional understanding of gender in some profound ways. Okay, that's it. So we've talked about some general contextual aspects of writing. Keep in mind, writing is a work of altruism. Your goal is to make your reader's life as easy as possible. You want to assume that your reader is generally informed, right? So they're generally knowledgeable about the world and how the world works, but they don't have access to specific information that we've covered in this class. So that specific information is material that you need to provide for the reader so they can follow you along. The reader is convincible. If you can make a compelling case, they're going to go along with you, but they're not going to accept what you say just because you say it. They need proof, they need evidence, they need to be walked through a convincing argument. So that's your job. And then on top of that, we have the 7 layers laws. Those will be really important in terms of structuring your paper. And when it comes to making your paper outline, it's really important to start thinking about your headlines, because that's going to force you to think about what exactly it is you're trying to say, right? What exactly is your thesis? And it should move you from thinking in terms of topics and in terms of thinking about an argument and where you're trying to go and what things you need to talk about in order to make the point that you're trying to make. So it will force you to start thinking of the roadmap that your paper is going to take, and that will make the actual paper, writing the paper itself, it should make that easier. And then also starting to find quotations that support your point. And you want to explain in the outline why you're using the quotation. Why does it advance your argument or contextualize your argument in some key ways? All right, on Wednesday, we'll go over, maybe do a quick review of this, and then we'll start talking about the paper, its formatting criteria, a few other tricks and tips that can help you out. And then we'll start maybe working on a collective outline for the 2 questions.